Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. Here's what's coming up on the program, though. Protests resuming in China's Guangzhou region as demonstrators clash with hazmat-wearing police. We'll also learn about Ukraine's foreign minister saying NATO has agreed new commitments on weapons for the country as foreign ministers end their meeting in Bucharest, Romania. And the French president, Emmanuel Macron, is in the United States on a rare visit. Both sides are trying to improve Franco-American relations. And let's get into it now. Frustration appears to be growing in China over the government's coronavirus lockdown restrictions, set to be the strictest in the world. The protests were renewed in Guangzhou again, with videos posted online showing hazmat-suited police clashing with the demonstrators. It's a scene that is becoming popular as the government says there's no turning back on those restrictions and does not tolerate the dissent. Another video posted online showed people throwing hard objects at riot police. Protests mark an escalation from demonstrations seen in Shanghai, Beijing, and in other cities across China over the weekend. I will also be focused on some of those protests going on, but a check on the Chinese capital, Beijing, shows some residents do support and understand the protests, which also stem from the death of 10 people in a fire at an apartment building in Urumqi. People think they could have been saved if they were not under the lockdown restrictions. A policy has kept China's death toll much lower than many other countries, but it's also come at a cost of long spells of confinement at home for many millions and damage to the world's second biggest economy. We'll see a video soon emerging out of Shanghai showing residents confronting COVID workers in hazmat suits. While the location of the protest is known, it's not been possible to identify the date that this video was recorded. Protests in Shanghai, in Beijing and elsewhere have been one of the biggest acts of public defiance seen since President Xi Jinping came into power in 2012. So the protests have also gone international. There are solidarity protests in front of the Chinese consulate in Toronto, Canada, attended by experts and locals. They're trying to put pressure on the government to loosen COVID restrictions and to avoid a repeat of the Urumqi disaster. And a number of U.S. citizens have joined their voices in support of the protests. Harvard students gathered on campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for a protest organized by the Harvard Chinese Students and Scholars Association. They held placards calling for freedom of speech. Nearly 3 years into the pandemic, China says its policies are not geared towards having zero cases at all times, but instead are about dynamically taking action when cases surface. Well, in New York, people gathered outside the Chinese consulate in support. The protests have become mainland China's biggest wave of civil disobedience since the 1989 Tiananmen protests. They've come as China's economy sputters after growing at breakneck rates for decades. Era of prosperity was fundamental for the social contract between the Communist Party and a population whose freedoms have been dramatically curtailed since President Xi Jinping took power at least 10 years ago. Joining me now is Deputy President, Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, China, Mr. Jeffrey Owego, who joins me from Guangzhou. We'll come back to him later. Now, China's former leader, Jiang Zemin, has died. He was aged just 96. Jiang presided over China at a time when the country opened up on a vast scale and saw high-speed growth. His death comes as China sees some of its most serious protests since Tiananmen, with many demonstrating against COVID restrictions. Same media outlets, including the Global Times and Xinhua News Agency, turned their websites black and white in tribute. State broadcaster CCTV lauded his role after the bloody 1989 crackdown on protesters in and around Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Well, one of the stations said during the serious political turmoil in China in the spring and summer of 1989, Comrade Jiang Zemin supported and implemented the correct decision of the party's Central Committee to oppose unrest, defend the socialist state power, and safeguard the fundamental interests of the people. Events saw China ostracized internationally and sparked a bitter power struggle at the top of the Communist Party between hardline reactionaries and reformers. It led to Jiang, who had originally been seen as a plodding bureaucrat, being elevated to high office, he was chosen as a compromise leader in the hope he would unify hardliners and more liberal elements. Now, under his stewardship, a formidable economy was forged. The communists tightened their grip on power, and China took its place at the top table of world powers. He oversaw the peaceful handover of Hong Kong in 1997 and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, which intertwined with the country's global economy.
中共中央军委主席江泽民会见了金正日总书记。
And we're off to developments out of the Russia-Ukraine invasion. We're learning Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba says Russia must withdraw heavy weapons and military personnel from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant if the UN's atomic watchdog's efforts to create a protection zone are to succeed. Kuleba and the IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi had a discussion about it on the sidelines of the NATO ministerial meeting, days after meeting a Russian delegation in Istanbul, Turkey. Spanish police have reported a blast at the Ukrainian embassy in Madrid, injuring one employee. A staff member suffered light injuries and went to hospital. The embassy is yet to comment on the incident. And the upper chamber of Russia's parliament has approved the designation of Alexei Kudrin as head of the audit chamber, paving the way for him to take up a potential role at the country's technology giant Yandex. Kudrin, a close ally of President Vladimir Putin throughout his career, becomes the highest profile government official to leave a post since the invasion. Sources expect Kudrin to take up a role with Yandex, which last week announced a review of a possible sweeping governance overhaul that would leave its central business units in Russia under ownership. And Ukraine's security service searched a monastery in the west of the country in what it said was an operation to counter suspected subversive activities by Russian special services. A search in the Mukachevo diocese of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was the latest in a series of raids in monasteries by the SBU to investigate church premises may be used, they think, to hide Russian weapons or store banned items. Historically, Russian-backed wing of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church announced a formal severing of ties with Moscow in May, but is still mistrusted by many Ukrainians and frequently accused of secret cooperation with China. The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, says the Union will try to set up a specialized court backed by the United Nations to investigate and prosecute possible war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Ukraine has been pushing for the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute Russian military and political leaders it holds responsible for starting the war. Hague-based International Criminal Court launched its own investigation into alleged crimes against humanity and war crimes days after Moscow's February 24 invasion, but it does not have jurisdiction to prosecute aggression in Ukraine. Back to the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, who says NATO diplomats have given him a number of new commitments, but declined to say whether that included a Patriot missile batteries. Equipping Ukraine with arms and equipment to rebuild its damaged electrical grid to survive winter under Russian bombardment has been a top issue at the NATO meeting of foreign ministers over the past 2 days. Dmytro told reporters after the NATO meeting today We heard a number of new commitments from various NATO members with regard to providing Ukraine with more defensive weapons and energy equipment. Ukraine wants US-made Patriot missile batteries or other air defense systems that are more advanced than those it has gotten so far from the United States and other allies. Well, let's bring in now the team lead at Next Year Nigeria, Mr. Dr. Ndunwokolo. He joins me from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Thank you for making time to be on the show today, Dr. Nwokolo.
Thank you.
Let's begin with, the meeting the NATO has been having over the past 2 days. NATO has just wrapped up its foreign ministers meeting, was another fundraising and support forum for Ukraine. Do you think the aim was achieved, though?
Yes, I think I have to be direct and say yes, the aim was achieved. So the aims, I think, because there are basically two things they wanted to achieve. One, they wanted to demonstrate unity and the ability to rally around Ukraine, because it's important to know that in this war, Ukraine has shown a lot of resolve, and there was a need to boost their resolve. And to boost their resolve, since NATO doesn't want to go out to join them in the war, they needed the support. They needed that boost for their resolve. I think that's what the meeting in Romania has been able to show. They were able to develop a comprehensive assistance from Ukraine, and more importantly, NATO was able to show this unity, this ability to work together, which in war you need it. When your enemy sees that you are working together, then they begin to rethink their strategy. I think that's what NATO was able to demonstrate, two major things: a boost for Ukraine and the ability to show their unity to work together.
Ukraine did make it clear that it does need more weapons, and every time any Ukrainian official is mentioned, they always say that they need more weapons. When the Ukrainian president speaks in his address, he always calls for more weapons. He calls for more sanctions on Russia. Do you think the countries, however, should begin to rethink the strategy towards the war before donor fatigue sets in and then this becomes another long war in Europe?
You're right. I think there's need to start rethinking the strategy and start looking at way to resolve and negotiate out this war. It's important for us to know that in as much as we see that Ukraine has a lot of resolve to continue the war, but Russia has better military capability than them. So in war, two things are always certain. You have good resolve and better military capability, or you have both, or you have one and you don't have the other one. So what you're seeing is that apart from having better military capability than Ukraine, Russia has one critical thing that is already affecting Europe, which is their hold on gas supply to Europe. And they're ready to use it anyway. And with the global inflation going up, NATO might start thinking, will this have a crack on us as a unit? Knowing that some of these European countries are not equally doing very well, especially with the global inflation sitting in. So will their citizens begin to ask questions? So I think it's important that we start looking at all these things. NATO should start looking at it and now find a way to bring everybody to round table and end this war, So I do not even think that donor fatigue is the most important thing, even though it's equally crucial. But how will they start handling issues of energy and inflation that is affecting them? How will this affect their own economy? This might be a food for thought for them.
Yes, but there is also the possibility of a long war in Europe. We're already in the 10th month of this war, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. Russia is refusing to get on the negotiating table with Ukraine because it's given conditions for the war. It's so-called military exercise in Ukraine to end. So we're looking at longer days and longer weeks ahead. I mean, how much more weapons can these countries give to Ukraine to fight this war, despite their own failing economies?
So I think that's a question they have to pull back and ask themselves. There are two things that are critical here. Why NATO is being constrained by the just war assumptions and theory. NATO is looking at, is it just to kill people? Is it just to get into war? What is the theoretical argument? What is the philosophical argument? Russia doesn't look at that. Russia on its own knows they have lower military capability than NATO, but they have a better resolve than NATO. So NATO is being constrained by a lot of things, which includes the just war argument. Why do we have to let people die? But Russia is not looking at it. So it's easier for Russia to work with other of its partners that are, non-NATO friendly, like Turkey, like North Korea, like China, like Syria, like Iran, to continue to supply those weapons that they don't have, continue the war. But NATO on its own will continue to look at the justification behind an all-out war and want to pull out and say, why do we have to kill people, destroy facilities just because of this war? But Russia is not looking at that perspective.
Yeah, and NATO is promising protection for Moldova, Georgia, and Bosnia. And then it also has to think about Sweden and Finland's pending membership of the alliance. Russia has threatened that Finland and Sweden's membership could accelerate militarization of the Arctic region. Is NATO in a fix, though, because it's trying to avoid an all-out war in Europe, especially with Russia?
I wouldn't just say they are in a fix, but I would say they are in a situation. There's a situation that they are being constrained by, like I said, by the moral justification of the war. Because of, if you are an organization that look at issues based on how and why, where the justification is always considered, human rights angle and all that, you begin to look at things from a moral perspective, from a religious perspective, from a theoretical perspective. I think that is what is affecting NATO. And it's not affecting Russia. Russia is all out. Russia is ready to. And again, looking at who is the president of Russia, his mentality, how he's wired. The other leaders are not that way. The NATO leaders are not that way. So they are more likely to say, let's pull a bit, let's think, let's not draw the whole world into a war. But Russia doesn't think that way. So it might be why, if I'm NATO, they have two things, and that might be the fix you're asking. Are they going out for an out war, or are they pulling back and negotiating with Russia, finding a common ground for everybody? Is important to look at it from that way, because we are seeing here is Russia that doesn't want NATO countries surrounding all its borders, and they are ready to do anything to maintain that neutrality. So if they can't, then we're looking for a Russia that will be drawn into a third world war if possible.
Longer days, longer nights ahead, for Ukraine and for Russia, with all the military strikes that have been coming in, especially from Russia. I just wanted to find out just very quickly, because it does seem to be a fine line, between NATO's Articles 4 and 5, with the missiles that are dropping, some also dropping near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Last week, one of them landed at the border village with Poland. And then there's also Moldova and the other countries that are afraid of, this backlash from Russia. So how does NATO navigate through all of that to maintain some sanity in the region?
I think that it becomes very critical here, because Russia understands that. Russia understands that not all NATO countries are very strong on its own, both psychologically and in military capability. So whatever thing that happens, that they are drawing the entire NATO into a war. Like I said, the resolve becomes very critical. How resolved is NATO to go into a war? The resolve Russia has is better than that of NATO. NATO is constrained by a lot of things. So if you look at it, what you're seeing now is a Russia that is more determined to have a war than a NATO that is more determined. So with countries like Moldova and all that, and with the economies, not doing very well, and especially with the global inflation and not Russia's hold on the global gas supply, It means that Russia is able to either find a way to hand twist those other European and NATO countries to have an agreement with them. So Russia will continue to push that angle, and pushing that angle might lead NATO to ask question of how do we resolve this? And I think that's what Russia is pushing for, and they may likely get it.
And so many more questions coming up out of, developments in Ukraine. Dr. Nduwokolo, a real pleasure having you on the program. Thank you once again for making time to be with us.
Thank you.
We'll take a short break now. When we come back, amid renewed support for Ukraine, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg pledged to support Moldova, Georgia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, but the issues in Australia continue with its former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. We'll take a look at that when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back to the program. The Indian man accused of murdering an Australian woman has been produced before a court in New Delhi today, where the public prosecutor has pleaded for his extradition to Australia. Rajwinder Singh was accused of killing Toya Cordingley on a beach after an argument in Queensland while she was walking her dog. According to media reports, Cordingley was 24 years old at the time of her murder. Singh fled the country on a flight to India's northern Amritsar city on October 23, 2018, leaving his 3 children and wife behind in Australia. The same day, Queensland police put his photographs on display. Australia is seeking Singh's extradition for his trial for murder to take place there. Meanwhile, around 700 Belgians arrived in court today for a mammoth process to select a jury for the trial of 10 men accused of involvement in the 2016 bombings in Brussels that killed 32 people. Belgium's largest ever trial began with hundreds of potential jurors filing through airport-style security checks and into 8 waiting rooms with morning rush hour traffic snarled up outside by police searches of vehicles. After a half-hour delay, presiding judge Lawrence Massat addressed the court to assign translators and asked the defendants to identify themselves and confirm their lawyers. They are variously charged with murder and attempted murder in a terrorist context and leading of participating in the activities of a terrorist group over the twin bombings at Brussels airport and a third bombing at the metro on March 22, 2016. Osama Krayem, a Swedish national accused of planning to be a second metro bomber, refused to answer any questions. The 8 others present gave the requested information. One defendant presumed killed in Syria is being tried in absentia. In accordance with Belgian court procedure, the defendants have not declared whether they're innocent or guilty. Australia's Parliament today voted to censure former Liberal Prime Minister Scott Morrison after an inquiry found his secret appointment to multiple ministries during the COVID-19 pandemic undermined trust in government. Morrison, who lost power in a general election in May, secretly accumulated 5 ministerial roles during the pandemic: health, finance, treasury, resources and home affairs. The historic motion brought by the ruling Labour Party passed by 86 votes to 50 in the country's lower house. It marks the first time a former Prime Minister has been censured by Parliament, though the motion is symbolic in nature. Morrison said he only used the powers on one occasion to block a BPH Energy's PEP 11 gas exploration project, one of the reasons for which he's been accused. And as 2 of the youngest heads of government and among a small percentage of female world leaders, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and her Finnish counterpart, Sanna Marin, have long faced questions about their age and gender. It went quick, however, to shoot down a journalist who asked about the purpose of the first ever visit to New Zealand by a Finnish Prime Minister on Wednesday. 42-year-old Ardern was quick to cut off the questioner. 37-year-old Marin, who is in New Zealand with a Finnish trade delegation, emphasized the country's growing trade ties.
War in Ukraine feels very concrete from Finland's perspective, because we share a long border with Russia, 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia. We have been in war with Russia, so the situation is very concrete to the Finnish people, and they need right now our support, and we have to make sure that they will win. So they need more weapons. We have made, for example, 10 packages of weaponry to Ukraine, and we also need to make sure that the sanctions are harder and harder against Russia, because the war is affecting all of us. Mostly Ukrainians, the civilians that are dying every day. They are bombing now the infrastructure in Ukraine, the electrical network, also the water network. So people are suffering every day in Ukraine. But it also affects all over the world. In Europe, with energy prices, with high inflation. Also in New Zealand, also in this region, with high energy prices. So we need to make sure that the war stops soon as possible, and Ukraine will win, and they will need our help. They will need hard power to win that war.
The focus of our conversation is what more we could do together in support of other women in other countries who are facing dire circumstances where we see the most basic of human rights being repressed and violated. And so I think that shows a sense of responsibility that we feel, given there are so few female leaders, to make sure that we use our voice on behalf of those that are experiencing such dire circumstances, and Iran is a good example of that.
I also worry about the situation in Iran right now, the human rights situation, the situation with women and girls, the brave women that are protesting against the laws and the security situation of women in Iran. We need to address these kind of issues together, and we will have this discussion in upcoming European Council in December.
Well, back to the protests in China. This morning, protests were renewed in Guangzhou, one of the regions where they have been pushing back on government's lockdown restrictions, said to be the strictest in the world. Protests have also been recorded in Shanghai and the capital, Beijing, where residents support the protests against the lockdown restrictions. All through the week, we have seen protests in New York, in Canada, as well as in Europe, all in support and in solidarity with the Chinese people who are calling on their government to change things. Joining me now is Deputy President, Nigerians in Diaspora Commission in China, Mr. Jeffrey Wigo. He joins me from Guangzhou, where incidentally there have been protests over this past few days. Jeffrey, thanks for joining me on the program. I know it's midnight there, so I appreciate your making the time to be on the program. I understand the restrictions in China as regards freedom of speech, but what can you tell us regarding the protests in Guangzhou?
Thank you very much for having me here today. As regards the COVID situation in China, currently in Guangzhou, there are no protests. However, about a week ago, there is an isolated case protest, and as regards the quarantine in certain region over an extended period of time. So actually, this is due to a breakdown in communication between those supervising the quarantine and the people living in those communities. Other parts of Guangzhou are still going about their daily activities. Some districts are quarantined. As cases increase, the government tends to condone such areas so as to limit the rise in infection. So as for Guangzhou, there is no protest. However, the government is trying to do its best to make sure it's not a citywide quarantine.
Let me understand. You're trying to say that some of the pictures we've been seeing online are false. There are no protests in Guangzhou. There have not been any protests against government lockdowns in Guangzhou.
like I just said, it is an isolated case of a particular neighborhood. It's not a general situation, because the first priority for the government is to ensure lives are safe. People do not die from the infection of this COVID virus. So the citizens and everyone are, though it's an inconvenience to everybody, but since the priority remains saving lives, despite the inconvenience, people tend to actually follow the rules so as to minimize the risk of wider infection.
Can you also confirm that there have been protests across other cities in China? For example, in Shanghai, just wondering, if maybe we should even ask, what the media is portraying to people in China. Are there any reports of the protests at all, whether in Shanghai or in Guangzhou? Well, you said there are none. And then in Beijing and the other parts of China, what is the media telling you in China?
Actually, I have not actually come across any media footage of what happened in Shanghai or in Beijing. However, what happened in Shanghai, it's a little unrelated to, like I said, the isolated protest that happened in Guangzhou last week. What happened in Shanghai was what started as a commiseration of what actually happened in the fire incident in Xinjiang. There is a street named after so many provinces in Shanghai. So people were actually going to commiserate with people who actually lost their lives. And they went with flowers to commiserate, and sometimes in the heat of the moment, and then more people gathered. If you take a look at the video, you will find out that initially the authorities were calm, which is quite exceptional. They were calm and they actually allowed them to gather and place flowers there. But at a certain time, I think things got overheated. But like I said, it is an isolated incident.
Well, it's easy to understand, how you're interpreting what is seen, because from what I'm hearing you say, there is a blackout, in China of the protests. And that's understandable because some of the protests have been, focused on freedom of speech. People want to be able to express themselves. Somehow the videos of these protests are finding their ways online. And we know that this has to do with the fire at Urumqi, and the government has defended itself on that. But has the government perhaps addressed the impact the lockdown is having on economies? Because I also hear that that's also one of the reasons people are complaining, the fact that businesses have closed, people are economically handicapped at the moment.
Oh, thank you very much. Definitely, there is no way the government can avoid these economic consequences as a result of restrictions in movement, business activities, as well as supply chains generally. However, the government's priority still remains saving lives. And however, like after the long Shanghai lockdown, the government did roll out certain policies for businesses and tax rebates, loan moratorium extensions, and such. However, there are still individuals who are still having difficulties in their businesses. This cannot be avoided. However, the priority remains trying to minimize the impact of the COVID and the COVID policy on zero policy. So I believe one thing about the Chinese government, they are not putting their priority on the economy right now. Their priority, as I see it, is on saving lives. And I believe once they are able to manage the COVID situation, I trust they know how to mobilize resources in trying to ignite their economy again.
Could you describe for us, what a typical lockdown in China looks like? That might help us to understand, what's really going on.
Right. If an infection is discovered in a zone or in a district or locality, first of all, they try to isolate that district. That district is isolated, so infection is not spread to other region. Movement is equally restricted, and people are actually advised to quarantine. And then there is the mandatory COVID test. Every individual has to undergo that same day, every day. And these results are actually analyzed, and the community are constantly informed about the results. Actually, every individual has a QR code. We'll call it a health code. So you will immediately be able to know if you've been infected. And whenever a district is actually condoned as an infected zone, that region usually the movements of people and other kind of activities are completely restricted.
How does that happen? How does the restriction happen? Do you have security? Do you have police on the streets preventing people from moving from one place to another? Because we understand China has a zero COVID policy, meaning that even if one person is infected in a region, in a community, then the whole community is under lockdown. Everyone is quarantining. So what does, the restriction really look like? Do you have police preventing people from leaving their homes to go places, or what exactly happens?
Or in most cases, actually, we do not actually need the police to enforce such kind of quarantine or restrictions. Or usually, the estate management communities, usually they are actually the ones who enforce such kind of restrictions in and out, or people are not allowed to come in and people are not allowed to go out, or you are expected to remain indoors in your apartment. Only times when we have to go downstairs or outside for a COVID test. But you really do not, in the major cities I'm talking about, you really do not have police enforcing such laws. Like I said, people are actually compliant with this zero COVID policy because they too equally understand it is for a purpose. However, we cannot take out the inconveniences these actually has on people, but since this is the first of its kind, people are gradually adjusting to it, yes.
And how would you say the Nigerian community in China is adjusting to the restrictions? I'm sure the businesses have been affected. What are you hearing from your fellow colleagues?
Yeah, that's a unique one. Looking into the zero COVID policy, it's a policy that actually affects everyone, irrespective of nationality. However, in Guangzhou, it's quite peculiar as many Nigerians who live on the southern part of China, these are mostly exporters and traders in small merchandises. So since major markets are actually closed down, and it is the Xmas season as well. So these individuals have been having troubles trying to secure the right merchandise that they can actually be able to deal with their clients back home. And for university students, their only frustration is they've actually been restricted to their campuses, but they actually get all basic amenities there, just that they are not allowed to leave their campuses. Other than that, mostly daily activities is disrupted for these Nigerians who this is their only source of living, but they are trying to adapt with the online kind of procurement as well too. But the inconveniences are still there for everyone.
Jeffrey Owega, I know it took a lot to get you to say some of these things. I also understand how careful you're being because of China, but we do appreciate your coming on the show, and thank you for informing us about the Nigerian community in China. We do hope that things work out well eventually. We'll keep our eyes on developments out of Guangzhou, especially because you're there. And thank you again for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me, Amarachi.
We'll still have more coming up after the break on The World Today. £4,000 in candy. How much can you eat? You might be looking very soon at the largest gingerbread village display. It's in the United States. To join us again. Welcome back. Several students are among at least 15 people killed in a bomb blast at a religious school in northern Afghanistan's Samangan province, according to local officials. A provincial spokesperson for the area says at least 20 other people were wounded in the explosion in the school in Aibak, the capital of Samangan. There was no immediate claim of responsibility, but an investigation is ongoing. Meanwhile, the Federal Interior Ministry says the blast has confirmed that a death toll at least is 10, but they're expecting more because of the nature of the injuries. One doctor at a hospital near the area said casualties were mainly youngsters. Back here in Africa, Speaker of the South African Parliament has received a report from a panel tasked to establish whether President Cyril Ramaphosa should face impeachment for allegedly covering up a crime. A panel investigated the circumstances around an alleged cover-up of a robbery that took place at his private farm, Fala Fala, back in February 2020. At a televised event today, the panel handed over its report to South African politician and Speaker of the Parliament, Nosiviwe Mapisa Nakula. According to local media, the Speaker says the report will be made public on December 6th. President Ramaphosa denies any wrongdoing. However, he previously pledged his full cooperation to the investigation and says he's happy to be held accountable. Staying in South Africa, though, the African National Congress and its alliance partners, the South African Communist Party and Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, have held a protest march to the Kogosi Mpamburu prison in Pretoria today in protest against the release of parole of the man who killed anti-apartheid struggle icon Chris Hani in 1993. 69-year-old Janusz Wallace, a Polish immigrant, shot and killed Chris Hani, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He's been in prison for nearly 3 decades, and a week ago the Apex Court ordered that Wallace be released on parole by no later than Wednesday, November 30. The decision by the Constitutional Court outraged members of the Hani family, the ruling ANC, and other social-political groups. Now, just yesterday, the 69-year-old was stabbed by a fellow inmate and is currently receiving medical attention. A person who attacked him has been segregated and will be charged. Channel Television spoke to one of the ANC leaders at the protest outside the maximum security facility.
Chris Hani cannot be killed twice. Every man die once. So we are angered as the people of South Africa about the decision of the CONCORD, which is the higher apex court in South Africa, that has resolved that Janusz Wallace, who brutally murdered our leader Chris Hani in 1993, must now be a free man. We think this decision is unjust, is unfair, and we respect the rule of law. We have to express our anger through this peaceful march that we had here today.
But what would you like to see done? Already Home Affairs has given that special condition for him to remain in the country to serve his parole. What would you like to see done?
He must rot in jail. That's one thing. The alternative to that is him actually telling us the truth. Why did he kill Chris Hani? Then all of us will be at peace. You can imagine how the family is feeling after all these things. So it will be important that he tells us the truth, or he must remain here in jail. We think it's unjustifiable for him to be out of jail.
But his lawyer was saying that the man who owned the gun, Clive W. Lewis, that all the others are conspiracy theories. If W. Lewis claims...
That's why we are concentrating on the truth. Who killed Chris Hani? Why? Because we believe that there is no white Polish who can just come from Poland and shoot our leaders. There must have been something, and even he died very arrogantly. He was, there was no remorse in his side. So we can only say that it's unfortunate what is happening, but it's important that as we draw closer to 30th anniversary since the passing of Chris Hani, we must be firm that Chris Hani was our leader. You saw people came out in numbers here to support, to ensure that we can show that we have not forgotten about our leader, Chris Hani.
Finally, just your reaction on the stabbing incident last time.
Well, that's a minor incident. This man murdered our leader.
The French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Washington, D.C. to begin his U.S. trip. He will be hosted by President Joe Biden in a rare state visit aimed at highlighting Franco-American friendship rather than the bitter economic competition between the two sides of the pond. The two countries are expected to put on a show of unity on common threats from Russia and China. According to a French presidential advisor, President Macron will try to convince the United States, which is in their interests, not to weaken European companies at a time Western allies are facing intense economic competition from China. Energy issues will also feature prominently in the talks at the White House, with France hoping to boost nuclear energy cooperation. Well, we've come to a sweet ending on the program today. For Gingerbread Lane artist and creator John Lovitch, gingerbread is a way of life. His gingerbread village display, consisting of about 700 houses, 4,000 pounds of candy, and just short of 1,000 pounds of gingerbread and about 6,000 egg whites, recently opened at Essex Market in Manhattan's Western East Side. The SS Market Gingerbread Lane display is just under 500 feet, about 30 square feet over the current world record. That's according to Lovitch himself. The Missouri native got his start in the gingerbread business in Kansas City almost 29 years ago. 10 years ago, he began exhibiting in New York City. This year, he has 3 displays here at SS Market in Salt Lake City, Utah, and in Kansas City, Missouri. Executive chef turned artist, works from home. He does all his baking in his kitchen in Queens, New York. And not just ahead of the holidays, creating hundreds of gingerbread houses is a year-long process, as you can imagine. Lovitch says he'll start preparing for next year, about 5 days before Christmas. He acknowledges a lot of work, but to him, it's a labor that brings him joy.
So what's behind me, or by definition, I'm standing in the middle of, is the largest gingerbread village in the world. We have multiple Guinness World Records. This year's not exactly big enough to compete for the Guinness World Record for the number of houses, but it is big enough to compete for the Guinness World Record for square footage. So if we get a wild hair between now and the 15th of January, we may make a run at another Guinness World Record with this. Here in Gingerbread Lane in New York City, we have close to 4,000 pounds of icing, just short of 1,000 pounds of gingerbread, about 2,000 pounds of candy. There's 700 houses, there's 1,200 candy canes. This village, I think, used about 6,000 egg whites, and I think we used just north of 4,000 sticks of gum to create the bricks on the side of them. So a lot of candy, a lot of sugar, and it's a very green process.
It would be nice to know what happens to all that candy and all that gingerbread at the end of the holidays. Thanks for watching. I'm Aranchi.